If this job seems dangerous, consider the price of a single mistake. These missions were growing. More men, more ambition, more horror. Before the strike, the Stormtroopers studied the dirt. They mapped every wire obstacle, every machine gun nest. They memorized the geography of death. Night falls over 1917. Loose files of men crawl into no man's land. Camouflage blends into the mud. Movement is a slow, agonizing crawl. A soldier reaches the first belt of barbed wire. He pulls out specialized cutters. A dry, metallic click. The steel snaps. He holds the wire to stop it from recoiling. Silence is the only shield. One sneeze, one tripped wire, one heavy boot on a dry branch. A flare hisses into the sky. White light floods the craters. No man's land becomes an open stage. The mission ends here. Many ended exactly like this. Command erased these failures from the reports to save morale. The survivors reach the enemy trench. A sentry stands by the parapet. A blade finds his throat. No sound. The main group slips over the edge. The silence shatters. A grenade thumps into the dugout. An explosion flashes. Screams tear through the dark. Gunfire erupts at point-blank range. Chaos is now the weapon. The stormtroopers press forward to key positions. No colonel gives orders here. Each small group acts alone. They exploit gaps in real time. Decentralized command turns soldiers into predators. By 1917, the results were undeniable. These hand-picked volunteers broke lines that had held for years. Their impact on the Great War was massive. Their numbers were small. The raid ends. The survivors vanish back into the smoke. The trench remains silent. A standard rifle measured 1.2 meters. In a trench, that was a liability. To survive the chaos of no man's land, the stormtrooper needed tools, not just weapons. The squad discarded the long Mauser for shortened carbines. Weight shifted. Every man became a specialist. Grenadiers carried heavy canvas bags slung over their shoulders. Inside, dozens of Model 24 stick grenades. This was their signature. They didn't aim, they cleared. They tossed grenades into dugouts while passing, and into the next traverse before leaping. Speed was the only armor. Hand-to-hand combat was a mathematical certainty. In the narrow, muddy turns, a bayonet was too clumsy. Soldiers carried trench knives and shortened blades. The sharpened entrenching tool became the most feared weapon. One swing could split a skull or sever a limb. It was compact, it was silent, it was brutal. Some units carried the cleave. This light flamethrower didn't just kill, it destroyed the will to fight. Defenders often broke and ran at the mere sight of the nozzle. Firepower evolved with the geography of the trench. Before the end, they used the long-barreled Luger with a shoulder stock and a 32-round drum magazine. It was a stopgap. The real revolution arrived in 1918. It was the Bergmann MP-18, the world's first functional submachine gun. This arsenal did not emerge from a vacuum. It was born from the blood and scrap metal of a failed experiment in March 1915. At the start, the German High Command bet on armor. They formed Kalso's assault detachment. These were pioneers, encased in steel. They carried heavy bullet shields and experimental body armor. The theory was simple. The plates would stop a Maxim bullet. The men would advance, untouchable and slow. Why did the German army eventually abandon this armor? The answer lay in the mud of the front lines. Kalso's men never got their planned test. An Allied assault broke the line, and the detachment was thrown in as emergency filler. The shields were heavy. The armor was clunky. Half the detachment died in the chaos. Metal plates didn't save them. Speed might have. Bullets punched through the experimental shields with a rhythmic, metallic crack. The weight made the soldiers stationary targets. Protection had become a death sentence. Captain Willy Rohr took command of the shattered remains. He looked at the bodies and the heavy steel. He saw a dead end. Rohr stripped the men of their plates. Only one piece of armor survived the purge, the Stahlhelm. The steel helmet stayed. The rest went into the trench mud. Rohr changed the paradigm from defense to violence. He reinforced the unit with a dedicated machine gun platoon and a flamethrower section. Every tool was picked for the kill. He gave them shortened carbines, pistols with drum magazines, and sharpened shovels. The weight was gone. The speed was back. Rohr's reorganized unit became the blueprint for every stormtrooper who followed. Captain Willy Rohr took his new formation to the Vosges Mountains to prove his theory in combat. Rohr needed a proving ground to demonstrate that his theory of speed could replace the mass slaughter of the trenches. In October 1915, he found it. The target? French positions in the Vosges Mountains. The standard Prussian playbook demanded days of heavy shelling. Rohr scrapped it. His batteries opened fire for only a few minutes. A sudden, violent burst. Then, the guns went silent. Before the smoke cleared, small groups of men surged forward. They didn't move in lines. They moved like shadows between shell holes. The French defenders, expecting a long bombardment, were still huddled in their dugouts. By the time they reached their machine guns, German grenades were already bouncing off the trench floor. The stormtroopers ignored the strongest bunkers. Why die for a concrete box? They bypassed the heavy fortifications, pushing deep into the rear to cut phone lines and supply routes. They left the heavy lifting to the regular infantry following behind. The methodology worked. In the Vosges Mountains, the casualty rates for the assault were significantly lower than any conventional frontal attack in the sector. Rohr had his proof. The French position fell in less than 1 hour. Friendly fire was the most common way to die before the battle even began. One short shell, one mistake in the calculations. To the infantry, the heavy Krupp guns were as much a threat as the enemy. Rohr's elite squads had to become part of the machine. The infantry's legs had to match the artillery's clock. This was the creeping barrage, a moving wall of steel and fire that shifted forward in precise increments. How close did they dare to stand? 30 meters. That was the distance between life and the edge of a crater. The stormtroopers waited for the earth to stop shaking just ahead of them. Then they moved. They followed the thunder. The barrage shredded the barbed wire and kept the French heads down. If the soldiers moved too slow, the enemy manned the machine guns. If they moved too fast, they walked into their own explosions. The air grew thick. High explosive shells arrived first. Then came the gas. Green Cross and Blue Cross canisters shattered, releasing clouds of phosgene and diphosgene. The men pulled on leather masks. Vision narrowed to 2 glass circles. Breathing became a rhythmic struggle against the filter. They advanced through a yellow-green fog, hidden by the very poison they carried. The coordination was flawless, or it was fatal. No one spoke. Only the whistle and the stopwatch governed the advance. The guns fell silent at the exact second the first German boot hit the enemy trench. The training camps had promised movement. The drills focused on the bayonet and the decisive charge. But by late 1914, those lessons collided with a reality where maneuver was dead. One soldier looks over the parapet. He sees nothing but gray fog and wire. Then the view expands. Thousands of miles of iron thorns, parallel lines of earth and wood. The front stretched from the North Sea to the Swiss border. It was a scar across the continent. Offensives stalled before they even began. Machine guns and quick-firing artillery turned no man's land into a slaughterhouse. Then came the rain. The ground dissolved. Armies drowned in seas of mud and tangled corpses. The Western Front froze. Millions of men vanished into the ground for years. In this endless deadlock, an event occurred that defied the logic of industrial war. February 1916. Verdun. The world was about to witness a tactical anomaly. How could a handful of men achieve what thousands of artillery pieces could not? The answer lay in a new breed of soldier. Willy Rohr's shock troops did not wait for the smoke to clear. They moved with the last falling shells. While the French crouched in their dugouts, the first wave was already there. They didn't storm the strongpoints, they slipped past them. They cut wires, they severed communication lines. Confusion replaced the front line. Then came the impossible. The target was Fort Douaumont, the crown jewel of the French defense. Normally, an army would sacrifice divisions to scratch its walls. The reality was different. 19 officers and 79 men. They crept through the freezing mist in total silence. No war cries, no heavy boots. They found an open gun turret, a gap in the armor of France. One by one, they dropped inside. The German soldiers moved through the stone corridors like shadows. They found the garrison. The French were eating, sleeping, waiting for a bombardment that never came. Not a single shot was fired. 79 men captured the most powerful fortress in Europe. The news hit Paris like a physical blow, a strategic disaster, a psychological collapse. The French eventually retook the ruins months later, but the scar remained. Allied soldiers now lived with a new, parasitic fear. They never knew when the shadows would simply appear behind them. The fall of Douaumont was met with a stunned, heavy silence. To grasp why Douaumont was an anomaly, look at the standard price of an attack in 1915. The Western Front had frozen. It was no longer a war of movement, but a brutal equation of attrition. Miles of trenches stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea. They would not move for years. Both sides relied on a single, failing formula. First, massive artillery barrages. These lasted for days or even weeks. Millions of shells rained down to soften the defense. The theory was simple. Steel would shred the barbed wire and bury the defenders alive. Did it work? Never. As soon as the guns fell silent, the defenders emerged from deep concrete dugouts. They were dusty, deafened, but alive. They manned the parapets. They cleared the cooling fins of their Maxim guns. Then came the second step of the formula. Waves of infantry advanced shoulder to shoulder across no man's land. Thousands of men moved in a slow, rhythmic line. They were perfect silhouettes against the churned earth. The defense didn't need aim. They only needed a sector of fire. Machine guns cut the attackers down in rows. Those who reached the enemy wire died hanging on the steel thorns. Even a successful breach meant nothing. The survivors were too exhausted to dig in. Within hours, a fresh counterattack would sweep the cratered ground clean. By the next morning, the map looked exactly the same. The cost for a few yards of mud was tens of thousands dead. The solution to these catastrophic losses didn't come from generals in oak-paneled rooms. It came from the men in the mud. By 1915, the front line reached a stalemate. Frontal assaults were suicide. Soldiers began looking for a way out of the meat grinder. The answer was the raid. Small specialized parties began moving under the cover of darkness. They waited for the thickest fog. These raiding parties slipped across no man's land like ghosts. Their goal wasn't to hold ground. They came to harass, to capture, and to vanish before the flares went up. How did the Germans turn a desperate gamble into a science? They analyzed the failures. Speed replaced mass. Surprise replaced the week-long barrage. The Germans formed the Stoßtrupp, literally shock troops. The British gave them a different name, Stormtroopers. The label stuck. The transformation was visual. Forget the rigid, shoulder-to-shoulder ranks of the 19th century. That was a target. The Stormtroopers moved in loose, scattered formations. They didn't march, they flowed. Look at their faces, coated in soot and trench grime, eyes wide from adrenaline and lack of sleep. They didn't charge the strongest bunkers. Instead, they identified the gaps. They ignored the machine gun nests and filtered through the weak points. The squad moved through the wire in single file. They avoided the concentrated fire of the main line. By the time the defenders turned their guns, the Germans were already behind them. They flowed through the breaches in the defense. The tactics from Verdun became a blueprint for every major army by 1917. Command no longer relied on the luck of the draw. They handpicked the best fighters from every division. These men formed specialized storm sections. Veterans from Rohr's original unit traveled the front. They taught regular infantry how to move, breathe, and kill in the new way. The British watched. They learned. They restructured their entire platoon system to mirror the German model. The French hesitated. They never fully committed to large-scale specialized units. But the Italians took the concept to an extreme. They created the Arditi. These were volunteers. To many, they were simply insane. They preferred the knife to the rifle. They charged into hand-to-hand combat with blades gripped in their teeth. The sight of them broke the morale of the Austro-Hungarian troops. Yet the cost of such aggression was absolute. The Arditi were a weapon that consumed itself. It was common for an entire unit to vanish during a single mission. Out of 100 men who climbed the trench wall, 0 returned. The loudest demonstration of the new tactics didn't happen in the mud of France. It occurred in the jagged peaks of the Italian Alps. October 1917, the Battle of Caporetto. Erwin Rommel was then just a young lieutenant. He led a tiny detachment of 5 stormtroopers. How can 5 soldiers force 1,500 to surrender? Rommel didn't use a frontal assault. He used a bluff. He moved his men rapidly, appearing at different points, shouting orders to an invisible army. The Italians, exhausted and disoriented, saw ghosts in the fog. Rommel stepped out. He gestured boldly. He demanded they lay down their arms. Then came the sound, a heavy, rhythmic, metallic clatter. 1,500 rifles hitting the stone of the mountain road. One by one, then in piles. 5 men stood over 1,500 prisoners. For this single action, Rommel received the Pour le Mérite. It was the Blue Max, the Empire's highest honor, usually reserved for gray-haired generals. The breakthrough wasn't just local. It was a systemic collapse. German and Austro-Hungarian forces punched a hole 15 miles deep into the front. The Italian defense didn't just break, it evaporated. 265,000 men marched into captivity. 10,000 lay dead in the mountain passes. 30,000 more were wounded. The scale of the defeat was so absolute that the word Caporetto changed. In Italy, it is no longer just a place, it is a noun. It means a total, irreversible debacle. The success in the Italian mountains was only a dress rehearsal for the main strike in the West. By March 1918, Russia had exited the war. Germany turned its full weight toward the final gamble. They called it the Spring Offensive. The mechanical heart of this strike was Operation Michael. It began with an industrial-scale slaughter. 6,500 German guns lined the front. 3,500 trench mortars stood ready. In just 5 hours, they fired 3.5 million shells. That is more than 11,000 projectiles every minute. The barrage included mustard and phosgene gas. A thick yellow-green fog settled into the craters, mixing with the morning mist and artificial smoke. The mechanics of the breakthrough were precise. Under this toxic shroud, the stormtroopers moved in small, scattered groups. They did not charge in waves. They leaked through the gaps like water. British sentries, choking in their masks, never saw them coming. The Germans bypassed the strong points. They ignored the machine gun nests and pressed deep into the rear. Communication lines snapped. By noon, the British forward zones had simply vanished. Panic replaced the defense. Thousands of soldiers found themselves surrounded before they could fire a shot. The impregnable trench system, stagnant for 3 years, dissolved in a single day. German units surged into open country, 240,000 casualties. Operation Michael did not just bleed the German army, it severed its head. The breakthrough had worked. Infantry units pushed 40 miles into Allied territory. It was the deepest advance since the war began. But the map was a lie. The soil was a graveyard of craters. Logic collapsed. Artillery had punched the hole, but the supply wagons could not cross it. No horses, no trucks, no food. A stormtrooper carried 66 pounds of gear. He marched through a wasteland where roads no longer existed. The elite reached the limit of human biology. They fought for days without sleep. They outran their own bread and bullets. Why did the front stall? The strategic hubs remained in Allied hands. The knockout blow never landed. In previous battles, Rommel's men would break the line and wait for the regulars. Not here. Ludendorff kept the exhausted elite moving until they simply vanished. By July 1918, the stormtrooper battalions were hollow shells. The veterans were dead. The replacements were boys. The German army had traded its future for 40 miles of dirt. There were no experienced fighters left to fill the gaps. By November 1918, The Kaiser's army had ceased to exist. The 100 Days Offensive shattered the remaining German lines. Fresh American divisions poured into the gaps. Exhausted, the last Stormtroopers fell back in a never-ending retreat. Their tactics had worked, their numbers had not. The elite units were victims of their own success. They broke the trench deadlock but died in the process. When the armistice was signed, the survivors faced a silent world. Mass demobilization followed. Most returned to civilian life carrying the weight of the front. They were ghosts of a dead empire. But the method survived the collapse. The idea of small, autonomous teams was too effective to bury. It evolved through the decades. In the Second World War, these principles formed the bedrock of the SAS. Today, the lineage continues. We call them Navy SEALs or elite Tier 1 operators. Look at a modern operative. Night vision, suppressed carbine, high-tech sensors. Strip away the gear and the core remains unchanged. They are the high-tech trench raiders of the 21st century. The empire fell, but the Stormtrooper lived on.